Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joey Croney. I'm the head of digital at KCRW, the nonprofit public radio station media company, part of the NPR family. I'm thrilled to be here today to host this conversation on not only VR, but specifically on how VR can be used to motivate and change people's minds. So we have a lot to cover. We have a great panel. We're going to start off with some introductions, and we're going to dive right in. So please help me welcome this great panel. Phil McNally, who is a stereoscopic VFX supervisor and co-author of a book on 3D storytelling. Kaj Larson, who is Emmy-nominated producer for Vice. Molly Swenson, COO filmmaker at Riot. Stephen Charles Jaffe, COO and filmmaker at Springbok. Michael Licht, creative director at Emblematic Group. And Lyman Missimer, business development, partnerships, and education at Google. So we have a lot of stuff to cover. We're going to kind of touch on production, strategy, and the future of VR as it pertains to changing people's minds. And the first question I want to ask the panel is, all VR experiences are designed to elicit emotion, but how do you guys define VR as a change agent? What are some of your personal experiences of VR actually changing and motivating people's minds, or motivating and changing people's minds?
I'm happy to start.
Go ahead, Phil.
Well, I'm just doing.
Yeah, please.
I've brought a presentation for one. So while everyone else is talking, if there's someone brave enough who wants to sit through a 9-minute experience here, maybe someone who hasn't had VR experience before. And when I say brave enough, it's someone who might be an animal lover but would like to be a vegetarian and is prepared to go to a factory farm and see the worst.
Do we have any takers, any volunteers?
We have one very enthusiastic.
Yeah, come right over here. Okay, Phil's going to get you set up. And while he sets him up with our live social experiment of changing people's minds, why don't we go ahead and let Molly answer the question, too.
Is that a leather jacket?
Yeah.
Burn that thing by the end of the video.
Exactly. I actually saw this piece at Sundance, and I thought it was one of the best uses of VR I've seen, certainly at the festival. So I encourage everyone to see it after this brave young man tries it. So yeah, I'm Molly. My company Riot, for those of you who haven't heard about us, we launched 3.5 years ago, and the goal at that point was to be the first news site that linked every single story to an action that the reader could take. So here's what's going on in the world, here's what you can do about it in one place. We weren't founded by journalists, we were founded by humanitarian filmmakers, which gave us sort of a different solutions-oriented take on the news. And we got into virtual reality about a year ago. The first VR piece that we ever did was for Tribeca Film Festival, and it was a solitary confinement piece. We had a friend of ours in Venice here who's an amazing director, prison reform advocate, who built a solitary confinement cell in his backyard to put his friends in it because he thought that, the creating of empathy for inmates who are going through a solitary experience was the best way to get people enraged about the state of, criminal justice reform. Sure. So we put a virtual reality camera in the middle of it and had a narration done by this guy who was wrongfully convicted of murder, put into prison, and while he was in prison, killed someone in self-defense and then was put into solitary for 20 years. And he's narrating this experience, and at the end of it he goes, in 15 seconds you're going to be able to take off this headset and return to normal life. But imagine if you couldn't. And for the last couple minutes you've been listening to his story, looking at a bed, a toilet, and a door, and that's it. And all of a sudden you're like, holy shit. And he says, there are 80,000 Americans in solitary confinement right now, and guess what? The United States has no laws against youth solitary confinement. So we're allowed to lock kids in boxes, or we were up until the very beginning of this year. And so we ended that experience, and this premiered at Tribeca Film Festival, with a petition with the ACLU to ban youth solitary confinement. And what we saw was basically every single person took off the headset and signed that petition. And for any of you who've been in digital media or, run nonprofits or tried to compel people to do anything after they've seen a piece of content or read a piece of content, it's really challenging. And we, for the last 3.5 years at Riot, because we linked every story to an action, have been engaging our success, essentially, not only on how many people were coming to the site and how many people were watching our films, but on how many people we were converting from passive reader or viewer into active participant. And we'd never seen a conversion rate like that before.
That's great.
on a piece of content. And so it was that, even though it was sort of on an anecdotal individual level, that we realized, oh my God, this is our medium. And this is the medium that's going to give us the best chance of fulfilling our potential as an organization. So that's when we made it the tip of the spear. We went to Nepal after the earthquake. We went to Aleppo. We went to all of our nonprofit partners. And at this point, we've done about 120 virtual reality films in 40 countries. And as of 2 weeks ago, just announced our acquisition by the Huffington Post AOL.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Kosh, give us an experience that you have of VR as a change agent.
Well, I blame my VR predilection on this one, actually, who, it was much less profound. It wasn't solitary confinement. She sat me down at a party and like strapped this pair of goggles to me and put me in this underwater environment where dolphins were swimming around, right? No music, no audio, literally just dolphins. And it was more like a watch the person viewing the VR experience. And this like sort of dumb rinky-dink little video, where the stitching was bad and like there was some lag rate and everything, was totally my eureka light bulb moment when it came to virtual reality. Because all of a sudden I felt like completely immersed in this underwater environment, just swimming my head around looking at all of these dolphins. And it was there that I realized that while the medium is like incredibly nascent, the storytelling for it is finding its footing, and it's getting better every day. It has incredible transformative power. So at Vice, we've been looking at lots of basically non-scripted applications of where this medium can engender empathy, and I think it does so through like trying to find this very elusive thing in filmmaking, which is presence, right? We don't even really have a vocabulary around VR, but if we did, I think what we're really looking for is to give the viewer presence and to make them feel as if they were there in a way that traditional two-dimensional storytelling doesn't. So, yeah, if you can get like a cynical like war correspondent like me to be excited about being in a tub with a bunch of dolphins,
yeah.
right? We can probably do some pretty good stuff on the news side, and that's where we're at now.
That's great. That's great. Stephen.
My name is Stephen Jaffe. I'm co-founder of Springbok Entertainment with Brandon Zemmel, and I've produced a number of feature films that were not VR, Strange Days, Ghosts, Star Trek VI, a few of those. But I've also had some experiences in what I think are socially changing films, like The Day After, which if we made it today, it would have been in VR, and it would have been probably 8 minutes long and probably would have changed Ronald Reagan's mind to sign the SALT II Accord a lot faster than he did when we released the film. What really got me and Brandon excited about VR when we joined forces was 20 years ago, my daughter nearly died of cancer, and Children's Hospital in Los Angeles saved her life. And at that time, I made a traditional 2D PSA fundraising film that miraculously raised $120 million for Children's Hospital. Thank you. So Brandon and I thought, well, let's go back to Children's Hospital. Let's pitch a VR fundraiser. And we went to the doctor who saved my daughter's life and pitched it, and he'd never had a headset on. It's always interesting, these de-virginization experiences.
Those moments, right?
And just as it is with sex, it really depends on who you're doing it with the first time, whether or not you're going to be interested on the long term.
And who's watching.
And who's watching, yes, exactly. Anyway, long story made short, Dr. Stuart Siegel, who is now the co-founder of this amazing young adult cancer hospital at USC Norris, said, you're going to make a VR fundraiser for us for that hospital. So last November, we shot it, and we're working very closely with USC Norris on a whole VR immersive initiative for them.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Michael,
Hi, so my name is Michael Licht. I'm the co-founder of Emblematic Group. I apologize that Nani could not make it today. I'm sure some of you really wanted to see her speak.
Yeah, there's a swap here.
There was a
This
bait and
is not
switch, and
Nani.
we truly apologize for it. But Nani and I founded Emblematic Group about 2.5 years ago, and Emblematic Group's the whole mission behind Emblematic Group was about creating pieces that change people. And we try to focus it mostly on volumetric VR. So we want to put you in a location that you can actually interact or at least navigate through, so you can sort of have some agency in the experience. And through our experience, VR, where you have some agency, where you can at least walk or at least go around someone if they're in the middle of a struggle, or walk up to a barrier and not be able to pass it because something's beyond that. These things elicit a far greater response, that, in our experience, than just sitting in a swivel chair watching some video. So every piece that we have done up until now, all have been about change. We've done pieces on Syria. We've done pieces on the Border Patrol, domestic violence. We're doing several other new ones for the summer here that are going to be very exciting. But that's been our mission from the beginning. And all of our pieces, like, we take them usually to Sundance and to film festivals. We're pushing them all up to Gear VR now, and to Milk VR, so you can view them on your headsets. And at the end of all of our experiences, we tried various different modes of gauging response, and sometimes we have questionnaires where people fill them in about how did you experience it, what you think. Here's who you can contact about UNHCR or different organizations to help Syrian children. And the most interesting measure that we have always found, and I think was our earliest experiments, where we just would leave people notes and a little sticky pad and say, whatever you feel or whatever you think after this experience, write it down. Here's information about what happened and where you can make change, but just express yourself right now. And we get these amazing walls just covered with all these notes with people saying, all kinds of, we're making books about all of them, but it's been quite powerful to see responses that we never would have imagined. It truly, it affects people, and they are changed afterwards.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Lyman.
Hi, my name is Lyman Mismer, and I lead the business development for Google for Education, and that's across our products. So we have multiple products that we bring to market for schools. Some of your kids may be using Chromebooks or Google Apps for Education or Classroom, but the most recent product that we launched is called Expeditions, and it's a virtual reality product. It's our first virtual reality foray into education, and the concept is essentially virtual field trips. So teachers can take students on tours of different places that their school bus can't go, and they can weave it into their lesson. And the best experience I've seen and had with the product is essentially it's about sporks. There's a school in the Bronx. It's a Bronx community charter school, and one of our kind of all-star customers. They use Chromebooks. They use Google Apps. Their teachers are super innovative, and we really like to kind of pride ourselves on the feedback we receive from our customers and how we act on it. And we actually got a letter from a couple students named Kelsey and Malia who had a problem. Their school was creating a ton of waste, and that waste came in the form of sporks. They noticed that not only were their students not recycling their sporks, but their classmates were actually just throwing away unopened packages as well. And they looked at the data, and apparently the school went through 1 million sporks per year. Which is insane.
It's a lot of sporking.
Yeah, I know. So and Molly and Kelsey, they tried to change this, right? They put up signs they put up special bins for your sporks right next to the trash cans. They put up signs. They put up flyers. They sent out emails, and nothing was really changing their behavior. So they wrote Google a letter and asked for help. And we saw it, and this was right around the time that Expeditions was starting to kind of pick up, so we decided to help. So this was our kind of first student-created tour, and what we did was we worked with them to go to the recycling center by their school, and created a virtual field trip using one of our 360-degree cameras of the recycling center, so they could tell their story about what actually happens to all of the sporks and trash that their fellow classmates are wasting. And we worked with them. We created the virtual field trip, and then we ended up helping them bring all of their fellow classmates on a virtual field trip of the recycling center to see where their trash was actually going. And after 3 weeks, they actually cut their spork waste by over 50% already. So I think that's just an amazing example of using VR to actually spur behavioral change in a group that is normally doesn't really listen to those type of messages.
Those are all great examples. Phil, do we want to check on our social experiment? He's almost done.
So
all right, we'll come back. We'll come back to him. As we think about VR as sort of a new media format and distribution channel, a lot of you kind of come from traditional filmmaker backgrounds. I'm curious what some of the advantages and disadvantages VR has in comparison to, say, traditional video or print or web experiences. This is kind of for the whole panel, but Kaj, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening is both from a production perspective and a storytelling perspective is like all of us up here are still figuring it out, right? If I commission a film, I can basically give a set of steering instructions to a production team to go out and how to execute that story or that film, right? Get this B-roll, right? Get this tight, get this wide. We have like a working vocabulary and a working understanding of how to build those films. I don't think that it exists in a sort of common language in the VR space, and I think we're all working to develop that. And also then there's just like the technology side, right? Like ultimately self-stitching cameras and like the ability for, your iPhone to become the new Theta, right? Like when Google releases the app that makes this a camera, then you get into the possibility for user-generated content. But I think the bottom line is we're figuring it all out, right, in terms of what are the best techniques for storytelling. And then obviously on the distribution side, we're also trying to figure out how people are going to watch these things.
Yeah, I think for KCRW, one of our big challenges is distribution. We go and we invest in the technology to create this content, and then we're sort of limited by our own ecosystem, right? We always want to, every time anybody does any sort of content or experience creation, you want to reach outside your existing audience and reach new audiences with that. And I think that's been the biggest challenge for us in terms of sort of VR from a production standpoint is, yeah, we can go and create these experiences, but how do we reach the new audiences with them? How do we break through? That's been one of our big challenges.
Yeah, and we're at the crawl phase of crawl, walk, run, right? Yeah. Like even the post-production process is sort of cumbersome and intensive now. As all of that gets iterated and streamlined, obviously the technology curve is very quick, and new cameras are coming out and all of that stuff, and then that's going to enable us to do sort of more efficient storytelling, like to iterate on best practices. There's some like very pragmatic things that happen, like when you make a VR film, like how do you hide the camera? How do you hide the camera operator, right? Like
where are your stitch lines?
Right. And if it's hosted or unhosted, like I'm an on-camera correspondent, like I got to make sure I'm facing one of the little GoPros, right? So I don't end up on a stitch line. Like all of that stuff will be worked out and is being worked out. But the next sort of evolution is going to be a technological evolution that'll allow us to tell stories easier, And I think you'll even see a convergence between some of our old school techniques of storytelling and some of like the new school VR techniques, right? Some of that stuff will start to look similar when the technology catches up.
No, that's a great point. And we have a high-tech solution at KCRW for our stitch lines. We use stickers on the walls. So if you ever look at any of our VR stuff and you see a KCRW sticker randomly stuck on a wall, that's a stitch line for us. So yeah, Phil. Yeah, why don't come on up. Come on, go put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
Did we change your mind?
Yeah, say something about how you felt.
Well, I saw two videos, one of Native Americans dancing in...
Oh, you got more of a show, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I got that by mistake, and then I got another one of a slaughterhouse. So I could see the first one is really nice, and you enjoy watching it, and you see the whole landscape, and you can turn around and see the mountains and see the people dancing, and when you get a little bit bored about the dancing, you can just admire the mountains and the sky. That was pretty good. And the other one is a fast trip to a slaughterhouse, and they show how the pigs live in very small environments, and well, I knew about this already, and I have a strong stomach, so it wasn't too shocking for me. I'm not a complete vegetarian, but I try to be. Yeah, but it's something that everybody should know, and they show not only the bad conditions in which the animals live, but how they kill them. So you see they electrocute them with a big, I don't know, a big rod has, I don't know, like a sort of helmet, like a claw. And then they kill the, well, they open the porks, they hang them, and you see the knife going down, and then how little by little all the guts
Sounds like a really good horror movie.
We're changing minds. We're changing
Spoiler alert. Thanks,
But,
Carlos, for being brave and coming up. And it is there. If someone else wants to watch it, we can.
After that, ringing endorsement.
Can I just add something? I just made a comment in the previous session, and I think comparing the two experiences, I want to enjoy positive emotions when I do virtual reality. So having seen just how they kill the pigs doesn't make me too excited about another trip, but seeing Monument Valley makes me excited and makes me want to do it. So I think positive emotions is what we should show in virtual
I'm
reality.
glad you got the lucky showing as well. So, just to follow up, so Dan Fung Dennis is the founder of Condition One, who's a frontline journalist. That was his background, and he was always frustrated that you could never really capture the experience of all the things that we don't want to experience. Being mortared on the front line and seeing people killed. And his excitement about virtual reality was specifically to be able to put people into the experiences that we never want to go to, and which is different from storytelling, but I think maybe the strength of VR is putting people into those experiences reluctantly, maybe. Thanks.
That's great. And I think, as we are talking about sort of the advantages and disadvantages of VR to sort of tell these stories and put people in these experiences, Carlos pointed out he got to direct his experience. And I think that's a huge advantage in terms of letting people sort of control how much and how they experience the things that we're creating and filming for them. It's sort of like they become the director of that experience. They're able to sort of guide themselves through that path, and that's a huge advantage we find in sort of the VR filmmaking space. Steve, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on that question of advantages and disadvantages from traditional media to sort of VR media.
Well, I've been invited to give master classes at colleges, and my first response is, I'm not a master, I'm still learning, and then VR comes along, and it's literally true, but that's what's exciting about it. I mean, most of us like to break rules, and the fact that we're making up the rules right now makes this an incredibly exciting medium. And I'll just relate one thing that I experienced recently editing one of our pieces, and I was telling the editor, okay, the action is really good going from right to left here, and I think the incoming cut should continue that. And he said, no, it's not going to work. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you've left the viewer looking screen left, and they're not going to know unless you do a sound cue where to look next. And sound is, and anyway, all I'm going to say is that the fact that there are no hard set rules makes this very exciting, because you can do amazing things with lighting. You can use lighting to actually edit instead of editing. You can do a light change on camera and do an amazing thing. And 360-degree spectral sound is something else. I mean, as much as I like to think of myself as a visual person, I love sound. I've always loved sound, and this opens up so many new exciting possibilities, not just for cueing the viewer, but for fucking with them, disorient them when you need to do it.
Well, that's a great segue. Let's sort of shift tactics here and talk a little bit about production and what goes into production in VR. And touching on sound first, VR, a lot of VR experiences, not all, are really sort of still in that sort of stereo channel sound recording environment, right? Where you have a left-right channel, but if I turn to the left, I want to hear what's to my left more and what's to my right less, right? Because I'm in an environment. That sort of spatial sound recording is very limited, both in terms of distribution platforms that are supporting it and also sort of the tech to create that. I'm curious if anybody on the panel has any sort of insight. I can share some other insights that we have. We are not doing sort of spatial audio right now because we're doing music performances largely at KCRW, but we have other issues with audio, which I'll touch on also. But I'm just curious if, yeah, Michael, please.
Yeah, well, I wanted to throw in another comment real quick on the last one. That was kind of quick.
No, please do.
Oftentimes I hear comparisons of storytelling in VR, and they always say, well, in the film industry, this, and the TV industry, that.
Right.
And these are very linear storytelling mediums. And my background was in video games, and I spent most of the 90s and I've spent about 15 years designing games as a designer. And these storytelling questions that I keep hearing asked right now were the same ones we were asking when we went 3D in game development. When we went from the linear side scrollers to like a 3D game like Lara
First
Croft or
person
Tomb Raider,
right.
FPS games, where we had a character going through a world, and all of a sudden we had to tell a story, and the person, we didn't want to take control from the player because that broke the immersion. So okay, we're in a room, the story has to be told, how do we tell it? And those are the same, any GDC conference, any GDC talk you would have heard, Game Developer Conference talk you would have heard from the late 90s, every year there's talk about narrative in 3D space when people have full agency. And there's great material out there, and it's a little bit about light, it's a little about, threshold crossing and being focusing view and drawing attention through different sort of tools. And then, accepting the fact that you don't have total control. You can't do this kind of thing, and you have to sort of craft an environment to tell the story, just like we're telling one right now. Anyone can look away from what I'm talking, but still get what I'm talking about.
Totally.
So it's. I don't really think it's quite as complex as everyone thinks it is. So
That's a great point.
All right. So anyway, in the audio side of things, we use. Because everything we do is in a 3D game engine, it's like we try to make it as realistic as we can, and we're still struggling with that. But with a game engine, I can actually literally put the audio sources where the audio source is coming from. So in a 360, you have to do all kinds of tricks to try to get the audio to come from wherever the sound is coming from. But we were just placing audio sources yesterday in our environment where people are talking over here, and now the player's standing here, and the player walks over there, and the audio source is behind, because it just stays with the physical environment. That's why I like working with volumetric VR more than the 360, because it's more analog to like a real environment.
Yeah, that's great. And I think sound programming in VR is so critical in that immersion, right? And just taking people
It's
there.
like 70% of the experience.
That's a great
Without
point.
the audio, it's really flat.
Does anybody else want to add to the audio question?
No, but it might be worthwhile just talking about the difference between volumetric and 360, and I don't know
Does
if anyone
everybody
wants
understand
Yeah,
that?
no, please
Yeah.
do, Molly.
This is
Give,
two
give us
very
a give us a primer.
Perfect.
Yeah, so Riot makes 360 films. You can view 360 films in a virtual reality headset. You can also view them on your mobile phone, just moving it around like this or swiping, and you can also view it in a Gear VR, or sorry, in a cardboard. Samsung Gear VR, which is sort of the top of the line cell phone based virtual reality headset that's fully immersive. But what the Emblematic group does, in particular so well, is this volumetric virtual reality that's primarily computer generated, and maybe you can describe the difference
Right,
between
and
that.
it's done. Does anyone here know what the Vive is, or the latest Oculus deliverable? Right, so there's VR headsets that are coming out that are based on volumes of space. So to view an experience, you don't just sit down. You would actually put up two cameras, and you can get about a 15 by 15 foot is about the range right now of a room that you can physically walk around. So when you do a VR experience from ours, you could be in a room watching a domestic dispute go on, and you might get, someone might run into you, and you have to get out of the way. We can make you like a child and kind of short and see what it is from the perspective of that child as he's trying to avoid getting hit by parents who are struggling. That's what volumetric VR. It means you can go around something and be in a space rather than just view it with a big round TV on your head, which is very good.
No, but yeah, it's absolutely a different production
Right.
process.
It's a very
You're
different
working at a
production
computer
process.
as opposed to using a camera. And Kaj mentioned Theta earlier, which is sort of the cheapest consumer product that films in 360 that self-stitches. It's about $300. You can hold it in your hand. I jumped out of a plane with it a couple of months ago.
I jumped out right after her.
But we primarily at Riot film with GoPro-based rigs, which means that before there were plenty of 360 cameras before, but they were really expensive. They required multiple camera operators, and I think the revolution for us as filmmakers was when we saw for the first time the virtual reality or the 360 camera that was GoPro based, and it was 6 GoPros in a 3D printed rig. And the first time we ever saw that actually was at Tribeca Film Festival, and 24 hours after that, the Nepal earthquake hit, and we brought that camera with us there. So it was the first time that there was actually a camera that was durable enough and easy to use enough that someone with no training could really sort of bring it out into the field and come back with immersive footage. But live action, very different than sort of volumetric VR, even though the viewing environment that you can see it in a headset is the same.
Yeah, I think at the moment, we'd all love to have full 3D, full 360, full ability to walk around in the scene, and we're not there at this point. You tend to have the full walk-around experience in a CG or volumetric environment, and you tend to have real-life capture coming from GoPro rigs and that type of thing. I think if the message is the most important thing, you shoot with what you can shoot with. You create your story or you create your message with today's technology, and you make it the best you can. And at some point, as these technologies merge, we hope at some point it's a capture of what is happening in real life in a volumetric way that allows you to experience it in the most detail and ability to walk around later. That's not a big data problem, a large data problem, whatever the correct term is, because then you're talking about just humongous amounts of visual data that has to be rendered live as the person is moving. So we'd all love to get there, but right now, if your message is the most important, you pick the thing that you can do and you do it the best that you can, like any media.
That's great. And as we think about production and sort of all the things that go into VR, one of the questions that I think we all get asked at some point, which is a little difficult to answer and might be a little frustrating, is sort of how much does VR cost, right? Well, I don't want to ask the how much does VR cost question. I want to ask the who pays for VR question, which is, as we are all content creators in this room, I assume in some degree or another, you have this new medium, you have this new distribution channel, and you have an audience that's there, but it may not necessarily line up with your budget priorities or your sales opportunities or your sponsorship opportunities in our case. So I'm just curious what the panel's experience has been, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of KCRW's experience, which has been very shoestring, being a nonprofit public media company. We got GoPros generously donated by GoPro. We built our own rig, 3D printed the holder. This is last year, well before there were actually market available sort of GoPro holsters or whatever you want to call them, rigs, right? And we do our stitching in-house with a few different plugins from AutoPano and AutoStitch and things like that. So very sort of low threshold in terms of sort of outsourced cost, and we're able to create short format VR experiences. In our case, if we wanted to do anything more elaborate along the lines of what the panel's been creating, we end up having to work with production partners that sort of have those capabilities. So there is still sort of a threshold in terms of I'd say sort of user-generated content, which is the Theta cameras, and sort of that lower price point, to sort of what we're doing at KCRW, which is a sort of shoestring in-house production effort to a more elaborate production effort, depending on what the content project is. But I'm just curious, in your guys' experience, what insights could you give the audience in terms of who pays for VR and any tips or advice in terms of anybody out there that might want to try and get a VR project, especially one motivated to sort of change the world or change minds, off the ground? What sort of tips could you give them?
Well,
right, I know.
Be judicious in who you give money to. Our company invested in this amazing documentary called The Ark about the last 3 surviving, well, it was 4 when the shooting started, white rhinos. And now there are 3 because one died during the production. But on the one hand, it was worth it to us to get involved with this without knowing if there was any return on our investment on it, because it's a worthwhile project. And also for kids, this may be the only way they actually get to see this species, because the tech in the medical side to this, to recreate them through DNA, is not ready. It's not
Right.
ready for prime time. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think anybody going into this business now that's looking to make a lot of money quick is in the wrong business. And I think we should take a cue from Elon Musk and try to democratize this in terms of making it accessible to everybody around the world, especially kids. I mean, Expeditions is an amazing program. I think what it's doing for kids around the world to educate them before they form hard prejudices it is awesome. I mean, Lyman may want to speak to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I am one of, to your point, you want to be careful who you give money to, and you want to give it to the right people. And coming from someone who has given Stephen's company money to produce an expedition, and multiple, we're definitely very happy with what's happened. But what I'm sure, as you all have noticed, a lot of the large tech companies are all spurring up VR divisions. And part of the reason for that is VR very well has the potential to become the next internet. As Google's been the front door for the internet for a while. Facebook is trying to become the front door. I mean, even forcing themselves to be the front door with their efforts with internet.org in India. So all these companies very well know how important it is to be the front door to where people go to get information. And VR, like I said, very well has that potential. So I think for content creators, a lot of our VR efforts on the tech side, we're trying to create and experiment with different content types as much as possible. So a lot of the large tech companies are investing heavily in content development. Like one answer is, we're paying for it. I guess in a way. But because we want it.
Did you guys hear that? Send your request to Google.
Yeah, well, no, seriously, we're actively working with different content partners. So if you're creating awesome, I mean, that's a shameless plug,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
anyways, to my point, I think it's important to make your content as cross-platform as possible, because you're going to see huge tech companies keep investing in this because they need to seed their products with good content to get people to start using them. So that's one thing we're doing with Expeditions, but at the end of the day, we're not a content production company. We don't want to do it. We have to rely on partners. We're experimenting a little bit in our VR division, but the tech companies are going to heavily rely on premium content providers like most people in this room and UGC, because we want to be the platform. We don't want to be the actual creators.
I think those are great answers. Couch, please.
And, speaking for a similar nonprofit, Vice, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, wait, are you affiliated with something? I don't know?
I think it's important to keep perspective. We're all social justice warriors up here, but as I listen to my fellow panelists, right, Molly talked about a film about solitary confinement, like you talked about a film about domestic abuse, we're talking about educating the masses, none of these are the content models that are going to pay for VR, right? These are news, right, and frankly, CSR initiatives and stuff are always going to be a loss leader, right? So you have to figure out a mainstream rev model that will help finance your pro-social VR production, right? And everybody's doing that. So let's be realistic. The content that's going to pay for VR is going to be porn, video games, right?
Sure.
Stuff that has much more mass consumer appeal. It's also going to drive the technology, by the way, right?
But I think to add to that, being on the revenue side at Riot, what we saw was a year ago, no one was paying for VR.
Right.
What we saw 6 months ago was actually a lot of people starting to pay for their first ever VR experience. That was nonprofits, that was brands, that was other media companies, and all of them coming to us because we had by accident sort of built up this core competency in-house. And what we're seeing now is, if you were paying attention at all to the new fronts or the upfronts, which are happening this week and next, tons of networks and media companies are announcing not just individual VR pieces, but serialized VR content. Because now all of a sudden there is a bit more, we see light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of these consumer headsets that are going to be coming out shortly. Microsoft, PlayStation.
HTC just announced a $100 million
and HTC announced that, exactly.
But it goes to say that the audience will ultimately pay for VR because it's most likely, at least for the near-term future, going to be an ad-supported revenue model. So if you can get the eyeballs and create good content, then you'll be able to monetize it to some degree, and that will finance both your good and bad production.
That's great.
Exactly.
Great.
I think
great
the
insights,
reality is we're talking about content designed to play on TVs, but no one's really bought a TV yet. So
Right.
obviously the end user market paying for content doesn't exist yet. And so it is marketing budgets and investors who expect 100x returns. So it's technology and it's waiting to see if that market arrives.
Let's switch tracks a little bit and talk about sort of user adoption and how this gets more mainstream. And one of the questions I have is, when we think about UGC and we think about these really low price point 360 cameras that are coming out, will this help with the sort of adoption of VR as an industry, or will it potentially sort of dilute some of the more produced and focused pieces with a bunch of 360 selfies and other content that just sort of floods the market? What are our thoughts on sort of UGC VR content as it affects other VR content to be able to affect people?
Coming from Google, I think there was a lot of similar concerns when YouTube launched.
Yeah.
The first YouTube video was a couple of dudes running around a zoo on a skateboard. And now it's a platform not just for UGC, but for premium content providers, and it's creating new celebrities every day. And especially in the education context, UGC is incredibly important because the most engaging learning experiences are the ones that are local and relevant. So just imagine a teacher being able to create a math problem based on the 360-degree photo she took of the football game featuring the student in her class. That type of stuff is incredibly powerful and keeps students super engaged. So the UGC, I guess the UGC content, I think will always be not like a huge market for monetization, but it'll be a big consumer market because people will want to create these experiences and share them in the most effective way possible with their students, with their families. And I think VR is right now, and for the definite future, will be the best platform to do that.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it's actually incredibly exciting to see the proliferation of these cheaper cameras as they get out there. I mean, I think that the stuff that Emblematic Group is doing, there's not really a user-generated content model for that. That's much harder, for the record, everyone, than what we're doing.
Well, Unity is pretty available, and the plugins to push to Vive and all these other ones are all very available. And then there's kids in school who are learning how to use Unity, and there's actually quite a bit of content. It's not quite as easy as running around with a camera.
Yes,
but,
it's true. It's not as easy as going to Best Buy. And
I didn't even understand a word you just said, so it's not that easy.
Did anybody understand what I just said to that? No? Okay, thank you.
But yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons that that Huffington Post was interested in us was because we, for a long time, have sort of based our model on how do we go to where the story is happening and put the storytelling tools in the hands of the people who are experiencing it. And so part of our goal with them over the course of the next year is to not only basically do training and 360 capability and core competency building within all of Huffington Post's 15 international bureaus, but to create a network essentially for uptake of UGC VR from around the world. Because especially for the news, right? If you're looking for B-roll from somewhere that's hard to get to place, or you're trying to figure out, okay, like what did this look like before the Civil War happened or something like that, you're limited. And if we can build what we're trying to build, which is the largest library of 360 content in the world for sort of global content like that can be used by news agencies and that can be used by media companies, I think that becomes an incredible tool for the media, for entertainment, and for education. So we're trying to, and we're not going to be able to scale into that just by using reporters. Right. So our goal is to get UGC content to do it.
That's great.
Are you going to have the first VR camera at the inauguration when Hillary? Somebody should.
Hopefully, I don't think we'll be the only ones there. I think you'll see everyone out there with their little Thetas.
I mean, this is right. Like Theta is probably destined to go the way of flip cam, right? Because the greatest VR camera you're going to have is going to be in your pocket when Apple can link these two cameras together and it self-stitches, and then the UGC market's going to explode.
And to that point, that's actually something we're working on. You can look it up. It's called Project Tango. But the next generation of Android phones, starting with Samsung, are going to be built using VR standards that Google helped design. So having the right gyroscope, having the right pixel definition. So the next phones are going to be actually VR ready, not just for creation, but for consumption too.
All right,
Cool.
Google
You guys
might
can
get
have
to it
that
before
idea.
Apple. Yeah,
It's yours. Yeah. You guys can have it. I give it to you.
No,
So as we kind of talk about VR, we talk about changing minds. There's been this phrase that started to come out in press and in sort of just chatter around VR, that VR is entering the age of utilization, right? It's sort of gotten to a point where it's no longer a gimmick, and now it's actually being used to not just change minds, but to actually have sort of a physical impact on people. And some of the stories I've heard, we've done some interviews at KCRW with some people that have been working in sort of hospitals using VR as pain management. So actually creating VR experiences that are meant, you have a post-op patient comes out of surgery, they go into this VR experience, it's programmed with very calming music, it's like a tour of Ireland or somewhere beautiful, and patients are actually reporting a 40% decrease in pain versus patients that haven't had the VR experience. I've seen a VR game that treats lazy eye. There's been a lot of sort of these utilization examples. I'm curious, as a panel and as we look to the future, either hypothesize where you think it might go, or share an example of how you think VR can start to have that real-world impact on its audience.
Well, I can say that when I was living at Children's Hospital with my daughter, and they had one little room for escapism for these kids, the arts and crafts room, which they never used. 20 years later, I put my daughter in a Vive headset and let her play around with a program that she had a lot of fun painting with, whatever that might be. And I said, if you had this either in the hospital or in waiting to do your outpatient chemo, would it have helped? And she looked at me like I was the idiot asking the obvious question. She said, of course. And, clearly there's a place for this, for people that don't have a choice as to where they can be, especially people that are ill. So, I find that so exciting, more exciting than anything.
I agree.
Except there's so much, anyway.
I really look forward to, actually what you're talking about with education and VR. I think that's going to be huge, and I know several people that are all trying to work towards this. And I should talk to Nani honestly on our side as well, because I have two sons, and every time I show them a piece in VR, it's just there. The data went right into their heads, and they understand it, and they can recite it, right? And I keep thinking, I hate to see a classroom with a bunch of kids sitting there with things on their heads, but I'm sure that there's a way to augment your education experience with really interesting stories about history and anything. Let's see what it's like to be the size of a human cell and travel through the circulation system. You can go beyond reality and go into things that you could never experience, right?
And to your point, I was just talking with Molly about this. What we're actually seeing, I think we've had around 800,000 students experience expeditions using Google Cardboard, and it's actually with Cardboard, it's actually it's an incredibly social experience, because you can go in and out super quick. So students are actually looking in, pointing out, the shark over there, the scuba diver over there, and then they're going back and interacting with their classmates, and we're seeing that almost every class we go to. So it's actually Cardboard can be an incredibly social experience.
Yeah, it can, and it's interesting too. We did a study on this recently, or some people came in and did a demo for us, where they did VR without the audio. Right? It's just you're still talking to people in the environment, but you're in a VR virtual environment, and so they were in both places at once, and that was a great experience, because we could still talk to him. He could explain what he was experiencing, but he wasn't gone.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
That's a great insight.
I guess 2 points. The first being that the technology that we're seeing now is the beginning. There's going to be a full spectrum of user experience from. These goggles may end up going the way of Google Glass, right? They may just be too clunky and geeky and weird to wear, right? And it might be retinal devices or whatever. So, but I think it's going to be a full ecosystem, from the goggles to walk-in spherical environments, right? All of that stuff is going to change. The second point I was thinking about was actually inspired by what you were saying about the therapeutic environment. In my most recent military, my most recent experience with VR is actually with the military, where I'm a military officer, and we use them as like free fall parachute trainers and combat simulators and all of that stuff. On the sort of contrapositive side, they're also using them as therapeutic environments for PTSD, right? And to simulate, a combat experience, and that theoretically helps you with this traumatic event in your life. So ironically, in the future, the same technology that gets you into a problem might get you out of it.
That's great. Well done. So as we sort of talk about VR and the proliferation of VR and the adoption of VR, one of the things that's a big challenge for KCRW, and I'm sure you guys think about this all the time, is how do we make sure that we're sort of reaching communities that might have sort of socioeconomic challenges in terms of technology adoption, hardware costs, and just education around sort of this new medium. One of the things, we talk about cardboard, and in VR land, this is like not how you want to experience VR, right? It's a much lower sort of immersive experience. It's still immersive, but not nearly as good as sort of the full headsets that you can actually purchase. But at KCRW, we gave away 500 of these. We sell these at cost for $5 because we want to have that access, right? We don't want there to be hurdles and reasons for people not to be able to adopt the technology. I'm just curious, how do we make sure that we are speaking to a broad audience and not just sort of this percentage of people that are the early adopters and the ones that are just able to fork over $600 or $700 for an Oculus? Share some of your thoughts around that, just as a panel. I'm sure it's crossed your minds. What are your thoughts? And obviously we're going to get to a place where hopefully headsets are commoditized, but until then, and Lyman, I think you probably have some firsthand experience in this.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think part of it is product design. I was talking to Molly about this, and I want to hear your thoughts too, based on what your thesis was. But one of the things that I think what we're doing in education is for every groundbreaking technology, life-changing technology that becomes inserted into your daily lives, the television, the cell phone, the desktop computer, laptop computer, the education industry in terms of mass adoption lags 10 to 15 years behind consumer and businesses. And we're trying to get in front of that with VR. And one thing we've realized that's super important is that you actually need to remove as many tech barriers to adoption in order to make a product viable in education, not just in a well-connected classroom in a private school in upstate New York, but for a school in Ghana with no power. And we actually did our first pilot with Expeditions in one of those schools in Ghana because to use the product, you actually don't need the internet and you don't need a login, which are two huge tech barriers in terms of adoption. You still need a device like a cell phone that can actually power the headset. But I think designing the experience and the delivery mechanisms to be as low tech as possible in terms of usage is super important. But I mean, Molly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, as far as, and this is something that we think about all the time, absolutely. I think that this is the revolution in it, right? So Facebook and Google have sort of led the charge in allowing for 360 video to be viewed basically by anyone who has a cell phone, right? So now inline on Facebook and on YouTube, you can view 360 videos that are computer generated or that are live action. Now, as soon as, Kaj's idea gets stolen by Google and the Android.
Again.
And, Android or phones are 360 enabled as far as capture goes, then all of a sudden this device becomes, for 360 in virtual reality, similar to how it is right now, which is a democratized storytelling tool for filmmakers and arguably the best we've ever seen. We have this thing that we throw around at the office that this is the biggest revolution in journalism since the printing press, because of both the democratization of capture as well as consumption. So, I think that, again, it is going to be a product issue for in large part, but look to this as the tool that's going to make it accessible.
And soon, poor people in faraway villages will be able to experience working in a Silicon Valley office.
Yes. I think we have time for one more question. I'd love the panel to sort of weigh in, consider this sort of your sign-off moment, right? What would be one of the most critical things that you personally feel needs to happen within the VR industry or within the audience and the consumer industry to really help VR mature and help change people's minds. And we've touched on a lot of these issues throughout the conversation, but I've just used this opportunity to sort of share with the audience one of the things that you're most passionate about or most concerned about or thinking through for the future in terms of VR becoming as mainstream as our televisions or our smartphones.
Yeah, for me it's pretty straightforward. It's a technology barrier in terms of there's lots of people with ideas, they want to try stuff. There's a huge problem of how you put the stuff together. And viewing on the other end is pretty easy. So it's really the tool set that allows filmmakers to make stuff. So, you know, all of that stuff, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's been a disproportionate amount invested in the technology and the hardware compared to the content. And I applaud Huffington Post and AOL for sort of seeing that. I mean, Riot was the first VR content company exit ever. And it was small compared to what the technology.
We
exits
won't
look like.
ask.
Yeah. compared to what the money looks like that's being dumped into the tech. But as I think a lot of us on the panel probably agree, the content is going to be what drives the adoption.
And
of the
just on
technology.
that point, that's again probably coming from a VC motivation of tech is where the exit is and how we're going to make money in VR, as opposed to how we're going to change minds with VR or how we're going to create engaging experiences with VR. So that until that sort of seesaws back to, okay, well now we have all the tech in the world from cameras to headsets.
Where's the content?
Exactly, right?
Yeah, I think it's a combo platter of the technology barrier that you discussed, and then the audience's conditioning and access to the content. So, you know, shameless self-promotion. I have a VR film releasing tomorrow, right, where I'm embedded with the 82nd Airborne Division. The two things that I really want for that film are, one, I wanted a camera that I could like jump out of the airplane with that like wasn't like a round dome with 8 GoPros that sync
Death Star,
simultaneously.
yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. Like, and then the second thing is I want that film to be like easily accessible to a bigger audience, right? And who can watch it in other mediums probably besides their phone and stuff. So when those two converge, that becomes an inflection point for VR and the VR versus traditional media competition.
That's great. Stephen?
I think in the Wild West environment that we find ourselves, I think the really important thing is for content providers and tech companies to deliver what they promise, because there's a lot of promising, it's all BS, except for people on this panel.
Of course, present company excluded. Michael,
Yeah, this
please.
is an interesting one because I don't understand why. I mean, we speak to a lot of investors as well, and we keep hearing we don't invest in content, we don't invest in content, we don't invest in content. And, you know, so what if you have the best platform? If you don't have content or you've got like 10 things on there, what are you going to do with it? I saw this in the video game industry for years. Anyone who ever worked at Microsoft and Sony on the hardware side knows content is king, right? Your platforms will fail if you don't have great content and a lot of it.
That's great.
And to kind of steal another point from Kaj, we'll sign an NDA next time. But he mentioned headsets actually being interstitial, and I agree with that. I think kind of the end goal here and to create like true mass adoption, it needs like VR turning into the TV medium where, you know, TV average 3 hours a day. For VR to get there, I think it needs to be as easy as pressing play on a YouTube video, pressing the power button on your remote. So, you know, essentially until we can have like a contact lens or a plug-in into your brain, it's going to be the full immersive headset experience might take a while to actually catch on in the mainstream.
Well,
I just want to add one thing to what
Yeah.
you said about plug into your brain. I just had deja vu
Google's
when
not
I
evil,
was
guys, don't
making
worry.
Strange Days, and it's funny because when I got involved with VR, I thought, this seems remotely familiar, except that we were proposing that it could be recorded right off your brain. So at some point, forget the cameras. It's going to come from here.
Right. Well, and I think just to Lyman's point too, and yours even from a technological perspective, and you touched on this a little earlier with the cardboard social aspect, right? Yeah. With cardboard being so easy to take on and off, you're able to have those social experiences. One of those challenges, I think, for this to go mainstream is to really crack that AR, VR code, AR being augmented reality, overlaid on a VR experience that actually creates a social ecosystem, because you imagine TV probably got more mainstream as it got more eventized, right? You're able to actually sit on a couch together for a moment in time and share in that experience together. So I think for me, the biggest thing it would be is that social aspect of VR is really important, right? I think strapping on this gear, we have to get beyond that to actually be able to have social experiences that are shared experiences and sort of relatable experiences to one another.
And that's not Instagram in your headset, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So we are at 12. Oh, let's take a question. We have a minute and a half.
Just curious what
yeah.
Google's doing with higher ed. I've worked with college students all over California, and they are aspiring content creators, and they're just really
Gathering all their data.
Yes.
Sorry.
I gotta be careful on that segue. Higher ed's it's not a we have a presence there in terms of like most higher ed schools use Google Apps for education, but our main focus, especially on the VR front, is K-12, because just the higher ed procurement model for anything like hardware or content is so disaggregated, as I'm sure you know. And for us, the main reason Google for Education exists is the revenue we get from devices only. Everything else is free. So it's been tougher for us to go into the higher ed market because all the devices are purchased in the consumer market. But we're mainly focusing our efforts in higher ed on the cloud and like genomics research. But that doesn't mean we're not open to working with higher institutions. We've worked with Stanford, University of Mississippi, and Columbia actually on a couple VR expeditions projects. So there's no big like higher ed focus, but we're still definitely working with higher institutions.
Let's take one more quick question, and then the panel, I'm sure, will stick around a little bit if you guys have questions for him afterwards. But right here in the front.
If you're looking at a lot of these inexpensive camera that we talk, there's an awesome capacity to create VR. But what I'm seeing, the problem is the distribution. 70% of content is now going video, mobile platform. But when you look at live, it's terrible.
Just the quality, right?
But the rendering capacity, the system. Do you see the hardware systems coming up where you can do
I think if you're looking at the Ricoh and some of the lower end capture systems, the quality is not great.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's plenty of high definition VR 360 videos on multiple channels that are 4K, and I mean they're crystal clear. It just depends on how they were recorded in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that's all we have the time for. I don't want my mic to get turned off. Thank you guys for coming and attending our panel. Thank you to the panelists.